All right, let me give you a few New Testament things here. Okay, so and then I won't be able to finish this lesson today. So the end of this one will be what I put on the video. But so let's talk about a few things. So we have. I'll start with Caesarea Philippi. Okay. So when Herod the Great was in charge, right? They call him great because he did a lot of building projects, right? So when Caesar Augustus takes over, right? So you know him from history. He was the Caesar in charge of Rome during these early years that Herod the Great was in charge. All the way up even through Jesus' birth and everything like that. Caesar Augustus so that famous Caesar was the one of Jesus' time, right? The kind of patriarch of the Caesars. So he was born at the same generation, basically, that Jesus was. He was already Caesar, though, when Jesus was born. And so Herod the Great then gets favor with him and is allowed to be in charge of this general area of Palestine. Then when Herod the Great dies, they divvy it up between several, his sons and different people like that. So there was this area over here was given to Herod Philip, right? And that's where Caesarea Philippi falls in, right? All this area of Judea was given to Herod Archelaus. Then we have another important spot is here. Then we have, this would be Antipas, for him, Herod Antipas. Then over here, this area was not divvied up, not divided. I guess they had kind of their own central structure. And so this part was not given to one of his sons. And so this is the part known as the Decapolis, right? So remember, they crossed the Sea of Galilee to get to a place called the Decapolis. So they kind of governed themselves in that region. It was a region that was not governed by a Jewish leadership. And so it was very much a pagan place. This is where the demon-possessed man was, and all of the herd of swine went in. They asked Jesus to leave their zone. That was in this area here. And so the different sections of the Promised Land were divided up kind of along these lines. And so for our purposes, this one over here, Caesarea Philippi, was named, obviously, to honor Caesar, but then to also honor Herod Philip. Okay? So when Herod Philip is building this, the Caesar that he's honoring is Caesar Augustus. Right? So he is still around at this point. In these regions up here, we have a place called Sepphoris that we'll get to. And then just below Sepphoris is Nazareth, right? Which is another important one for our purposes. So we have Nazareth clearly being where Jesus is from. Then there is a main road kind of right through this section that connects these two, and even goes through this one to Damascus. So when Paul is on the road to Damascus, it is this main road that kind of also goes over towards where Jesus was born, goes through Caesarea Philippi, and ends in Damascus. Damascus, if you remember, we've talked about that, was a huge city. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. So Paul is heading there. This is where Paul's, after his conversion, he goes blind to this area. So he is at a major city. And so the Lord stopped him before he got there. So that would have been a big deal if he'd have killed all the Christians in Damascus, because that was a major city, right? So that was his goal, was, okay, let me find the metropolis where I can get the most Christians for my dollar, so to speak, And so he was on his way there. And so Caesarea Philippi then is this town being built by Herod Philip to honor Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was Caesar when Jesus was born, right? Which is interesting because on his money, he put his title as the Son of God. And so on all of their money, in that one generation, all of their money said Caesar Augustus, the Son of God, right? Which is interesting because now here into that world where everyone in the whole world is supposed to worship Caesar. So that was part of it. He didn't care if you worshiped other people too. They didn't impose that, but everyone was supposed to worship, and they kind of gave the Jews a little slack because they were so rebellious. So we don't see that as much here. But all across the rest of the world, there were churches to Caesar everywhere, right? That was the religion of the day. And so all around the world, everyone is worshiping Caesar Augustus as Son of God, right? And so into that is born Jesus, right? And so Jesus is born into a world where most of the world is worshiping Caesar as the Son of God, right? It's on their money. It's on everything that they transact with, is that Caesar Augustus is the Son of God. And so into that world, Jesus is born, right? And so, Jesus is born down here in Bethlehem, goes to Egypt, comes back to Nazareth, which we'll talk about either today or on the video. But the interesting thing about then Caesarea Philippi is that when Herod is building it, there is a natural feature there, right? It's a giant kind of rock that is there, that the whole city is basically built around this natural feature. And out of it is this dark cave, right? And then that goes way down into the earth. And then out of this comes this river, right? This spring, right? This spring comes all the way down here and is one of the prime sources. There's three, but is one of the three sources of the Jordan River, right? It's this here. So this is all of the Jordan comes from about three different spots. This natural spring here is very large, and it feeds into what becomes the Jordan River down here, right? So in this area, now keep in mind the story here, right, that happens in the Gospels, is that when Jesus is getting ready to be crucified, right, and he knows it, he's already telling them he's about to die down here in Jerusalem. He's ministering in the Galilean region, right? He spent the vast majority of his time there. We see him in Jerusalem a lot in the Gospels, but that is just the birth stories and the Passion, right? There's only one or two little small stories in between where he comes down for a festival. That's it. All the rest of his ministry and his life, for that part, is not done in Jerusalem. He spends most of his life up here in the Galilee region. But because the Passion, his death, and his birth were such important stories, they get a lot of space in the Gospels. But in terms of actual time, I mean, his Passion was only a week. He was only down there about a week, for the festival. And then in his birth, I mean, he was there for a little bit, but he was real young. So almost all of his adult life was not down here. It was up here in this region. And so when he gets ready to make his march down to Jerusalem, he goes out of his zone here and goes way over here to Caesarea Philippi, right? To a spot that he hasn't really been ministering at any other point. He hasn't done any ministry that we know of over here. This is a specific journey that he takes them to see this city specifically, right? That is built around this rock. So when they get there, the disciples are here, right? That's the 12 disciples, right? And Jesus. And so they're here watching this, and Jesus says to them, who do people say that I am? And he asks Peter, who do you say that I am? And he says, you are the Christ, the anointed one, right? The Son of the living God, right? So direct confrontation with this, right? Which this city was built to honor him, right? So this city is here in honor. It's named after Caesar. It's there to honor Caesar Augustus, the Son of God. And Peter says that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, right? And so it's important to understand that revelation is not just revelation directed towards Jesus. It's also revelation directed towards the culture of the day that is saying Caesar Augustus is Son of God, right? And so he takes them to this place that is in honor of Caesar Augustus and says that you are really the Son of God, right? So that's an important part of the story. And so Jesus tells them, upon this rock, right? Now keep in mind the disciples are right here, and the town is a rock. I mean, that's what the town is, a rock with community all the way around it, but the center part is this giant rock with a cave that feeds the Jordan. And so Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, which is often what this was referred to, because it's such a deep cave that went down that looked like it's going to hell. So they call it the gates of Hades, right? And so that's what this is. And so it carved into this rock were all these like little cutouts where they would put idols. You know how places would do like something like this? They'd cut out a section and make a little shelf and put an idol in it or something. So they have this stuff. So they made this whole area here because the old name for this place was Peneus, right? It is modern day Bunias today. I guess Arabs have a hard time pronouncing the letter P. So almost anything that has a P in it now is a B over there because they had a hard time. So it's Bunias is what it got renamed. But anyways, that is the old Peneus, which is the biblical Caesarea Philippi, right? So the reason that it was called Peneus is because Pan was a Greek and Roman god, right, of the underworld, right? And so they have this gates of Hades, this deep cavern. So what better place to set up a shrine for the god of the underworld than right here on this rock, right? So they worshipped the god Pan here. But we haven't 100% confirmed this from archaeology because they haven't been able to excavate this very good, but we have coins that show pictures and that have inscriptions that lead us to believe. We know for a fact that Herod built a temple here to Caesar Augustus, right? So we know that from history, that somewhere in town he built one. From the money and the inscription of the money, it appears that he built it here, which would make sense, right on the top of the rock, right? And he built this big white temple in honor of Caesar Augustus, probably to show geographically, which is how they would like to do, that Caesar is greater than this god, right? And so he puts the temple for the worship of Caesar, which they had those all over the place, right? Every major city in the world back then had a temple built somewhere to Caesar. So if this whole place is known for worshiping Pan, the god of the underworld, what better way to say that Caesar is the true son of God than to put his temple right above, right? And so we know that there was this giant temple built to Caesar Augustus. And what better place? They haven't excavated the top, so they can't confirm if it's there. But from, like I said, from money from that time and the inscriptions on the money, it makes it seem like that this is exactly where they put it. And so, which I think adds another dimension to what Jesus is saying, because Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church, right? So they're looking at a rock with a church to the Son of God, right? And Jesus brings them here to look at this rock with a temple on it to the Son of God, as if to say that the gates of Hades are not as great as Caesar Augustus, because he is the Son of God. And so Jesus takes them there to this, and he says, upon this rock I will build my church. Seeming that the implication is either, it's not this rock here, he's using this as the metaphor. So the rock is either Jesus, right, or the confession of Peter, right, that Peter believed that Jesus is the Son of God. And that is, to me, that seems the most likely, because the church is believers. When Jesus says, I'm going to build my church on this, maybe, and he renames Peter Rock, so it kind of makes you think he's talking about believers, like not Peter himself. Peter is a symbol of every other believer that would also believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so he names Peter Rock. Here, at this spot, is where Peter gets renamed Rock, right? His name was Simon until they get here. And Jesus then calls him Peter, which means rock. And so the reason that he's calling him Rock here is that this is what the church is going to be built on, is either the disciples, that's part of it, that they were the foundation, but more likely it is the confession part, that Peter realized that Jesus is the real Son of God, and that would be what Jesus, that revelation would be what Jesus would build his church on, that is the sure foundation of the New Testament church, is the revelation that Jesus is the Son of God, right? And I think that's what he's saying here, is that he takes them to this place where there is a temple to the false Son of God, trying to show that this false Son of God is greater than the gates of Hades, right? And Jesus says that upon this, knowing that I am the true Son of God, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades aren't going to prevail above me. That really I am the one that's greater than hell, not the Caesar Augustus. And so knowing that area tends to help us to understand this story better, that he had built this giant temple in honor of Caesar. And so as Paul passes through this is right where Paul is passing through here, is where Paul has his revelation that Jesus is the Son of God. When he sees the bright light and Jesus speaks to him and he realizes that he is the Son of God, where Paul has his conversion, was right around here too, because he's on the road to Damascus. So this is only like a mile or two here. So it's somewhere right around the same spot that Peter has his revelation that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that Paul has his revelation that Jesus is the Christ and the Son of the living God. And so I think there's a lot of interesting picture here. So this is the last place that Jesus takes them before he makes a straight beeline down to Jerusalem to be crucified. Right. So within just a few weeks of this, just however long it took him to walk, he said his face like flint, and went from here to there in a very direct line. Right. And then he shows up to Mary and Martha's house, raises Lazarus from the dead, and then him and Lazarus go to the Passover, and everyone comes out shouting Hosanna. So this is the progression, that they come from here straight down to here. Now it might have taken them a few weeks. It's a long journey, but that was it. From here to here was a straight shot. And then let me talk about Nazareth just a little bit. I only got a couple minutes, so I'll just throw this out just a little bit. The city of Sepphoris was a huge city, right? That was built just like 3 miles north of Nazareth, where Jesus lived. So in that day, where people walked all the time, 3 miles, that was your main town. So like if you had to go get food and stuff, that's probably where they went. And so Sepphoris was the biggest city in the region over there. It wasn't the capital. They tried to build a different one later that wasn't as big, that ended up being the capital, but it's called Tiberias, was the other city there, but in honor of another Caesar later. But Sepphoris, during the time of Jesus, was a huge city it took them 20 years to build it. It had been destroyed in the wars where Rome took over, and then Herod's son begins the building project of rebuilding it. So this is conjecture, this part that I'm about to say here, but we know that for a while Jesus fled from Jerusalem to Egypt. Right? His parents went down and lived in Egypt for a little bit, right? And then when the Lord sent them back, he sent them to Nazareth, right? Right around the time that Sepphoris is beginning to be built, right? And so there's massive construction, lots of work, lots of things for people to get involved in. Jesus was known as the son of the carpenter. So it's entirely possible that the Lord sent Joseph and Mary here because there'd be lots of work. This was a building project that just about anybody that needed work could find work for 20 years. They were building this place. So that's just conjecture on my part. But carpenter, a lot of times we get, even in the movies, Jesus building things with wood, right? This is just the word for builder, right? And vast majority of builders in Jesus' day were not using wood. They were using stone. Mm-hmm. So So it's much more likely Jesus was a stone worker than it was that he was a woodworker. Can't prove that, um, but this word almost always meant back then, because when people were building stuff, they weren't building wood buildings like how we do today. We have wood infrastructure. They were, for the most part, building with stone walls, rock walls of some kind. And so when somebody says they were a builder, right? Today we translate that carpenter. A lot of times that has to do with tradition too, because now the tradition is that Jesus worked with wood. So we try and choose an English word that makes it imply that he worked with wood. But if you go back to the Greek there, that is just a word for builder. It means Jesus was the son of a builder. And so most likely they worked with stone. And you see many of Jesus' references, a lot of his stories deal with stone. I am the chief cornerstone. I'm the foundation stone. You know, those types of things. Jesus used a lot of metaphors for buildings made with stone, right?
On this rock I'll build my church.
Yeah, on this rock I'll build my church. You know, yeah. And so he uses a lot of stone metaphors for how to build things, right? So that's most likely what it is. And so Sepphoris, if Jesus and his father understood stonework and how to build buildings with stone, then that was most likely where they got their work, because they would have lived just outside of the big city of that world, of this whole region. Sepphoris was their main city. And then some other people have pointed out that there was a giant theater in Sepphoris, right? So talking 5,000 to 7,000 seats, just outside of where Jesus lived. And so we see him using lots of metaphors for that too. The hypocrite, right, was the actor in one of these theaters. And so just outside of Nazareth in this giant city was this huge theater, which back then 5,000 to 7,000 seats was probably well known for the whole region. I mean, that's pretty big anywhere. And for back then, that was a good sized theater. And so we see Jesus using a lot of metaphors for that, that the Pharisees were like hypocrites, right? Like actors. And so possibly some of that came from Sepphoris. So anyway, it's kind of interesting that Jesus lived right next to that, but we don't hear it ever mentioned in the Bible at all, really, Jesus going there, which is another kind of interesting thing, that he kind of skips over Sepphoris and spends a lot of his time in these smaller cities, reasonably smaller. They weren't like huts or anything, but they were definitely smaller than Sepphoris. And so makes you wonder if that area was so carnal that Jesus skipped right over it. Having lived there, he knew, because this is where he grew up, would have been there, maybe worked there a long time, and so maybe the Lord had, if he worked there, he knew what that area was like, and he skipped right over it. Also, probably very much populated with Greek and Romans too, more so than some of these other cities. These other cities had Greek and Romans kind of overseeing things to make sure everything was okay, but the population was primarily Jewish. Whereas you would expect in a large city like Sepphoris that a lot of just the Greek and Roman, just regular population would flock there, right? So that could be part two, because we see in different places Jesus says, "I'm only sent to the house of Israel on this mission," right? And so Jesus, for the most part, kept most of his ministry just to the house of the Lord, right? And so that could be why he skipped over Sepphoris, because it clearly would have had a predominant population of Greeks and Romans. Okay. All right, we are out of time. So I will put up, like I said, some extra videos, and we will do some more things with the New Testament in that other video. And then when I put that up, I will put up your final review after that. So the stuff that I put up in the video on New Testament will be on the final also, right? So you'll make sure you want to watch that one. Some of that information will be on the final, okay? All right, so did you learn anything over these last 3 months? Hopefully, good. Yeah, it's good to, it's all about exposure, right? It's not about remembering everything that I talked about. It's about being exposed to the fact that there's a lot of connections to things. There's a lot of interesting things to learn through study. There's a lot of stuff that understanding the world of the Bible helps you to understand the written parts of the Bible better. And so a class like this is not designed to give you everything that you need, but it's designed to show you that, wow, if I really get into reading and studying a lot of things, that there's a lot of stuff of connections between different stories and understanding stories because I know now what was there, things like that, that these should pique your curiosity to be a lifelong learner. That's the goal, is to show you the types of things that can be discovered through study. It's not every page of every book is going to have some great revelation like this, but a consistent uh, lifestyle of reading and learning, you'll begin to put a lot of this stuff together, and you'll begin to have layers of really neat stories and things from the Word. So that is the goal of this class, more than the homework or more than anything else. It is to get you interested and exposed to ways of seeing the Word, right? Okay, let's pray. Lord, thank you for this class. And I pray that it would accomplish your purpose. Lord, I pray that we would be growing in our hunger for your Word and to understand your Word in greater and greater depth as we live our life, Lord. And I pray that will lead us to consistent study, to hunger for more, Lord. And I pray that you'll begin that work in Jesus' name. Amen.